The living room felt colder than it should have for a late spring morning. Sunlight filtered through the half-open blinds, casting long stripes across the hardwood floor. Elaine sat on the edge of the couch, her hand wrapped loosely around a mug of coffee that had long since turned lukewarm. Across the room, her daughter Natalie moved briskly, her voice light and clipped as she adjusted the diaper bag slung over her shoulder. Beside her stood a young woman, early 20s, cheerful, polished, unfamiliar, holding little Sophie on her hip like some kind of accessory. Natalie barely looked at Elaine as she spoke, already halfway out the door. "It's just easier. This way, Mom." No question, no invitation for discussion, just a statement handed down like a final decision, polished and practiced. The babysitter smiled politely, offering a small wave that felt more dismissive than friendly, as if acknowledging an employee who was no longer needed. Sophie giggled, her tiny hands reaching for the dangling charm on the babysitter's bracelet, completely unaware of the quiet shift happening around her. Elaine's mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words formed. What was there to say? That she was still here? That she was perfectly capable of watching her own granddaughter? That she had, in fact, cared for Sophie since the day she was born while Natalie returned to work, managing bottles and naps and scraped knees with the kind of love only a grandmother could give. But now, none of that seemed to matter. The babysitter had credentials, a flexible schedule, and more importantly, wasn't family, which somehow made things easier. The front door closed gently behind them, the soft click slicing through, the stillness like a blade. The house fell into silence, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Elaine stared at the door for a long moment, the outline of her reflection faint in the glass. Her coffee sat untouched on the table beside her, the steam long faded, as hollow as the space Natalie had left behind. She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of something she couldn't yet name sink deeper into her chest. This wasn't just about today. It was about what had been slowly building for months, maybe even years. A widening distance between mother and daughter, unspoken grievances, subtle dismissals wrapped in polite smiles. And now this, being replaced not because she couldn't handle the responsibility, but because she had quietly become inconvenient. The house felt larger somehow, emptier. Not in the way it had when her husband passed. That was grief, sharp and consuming. This was different. This was erasure, slow and deliberate. She could still hear Sophie's laughter echoing faintly in her ears, but now it belonged to someone else's afternoon. Elaine sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes tracing the path they had just walked out. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was silent, dressed in convenience, wrapped in the soft voice of her only child saying, "It's just easier this way, Mom." Long before the silence of this house, there was a time when life pulsed with noise, chaos, and desperate determination. Elaine could still see herself, younger, thinner, face lined more by worry than age, rushing from one job to the next. The diner shifts that started at dawn, the late nights answering phones at the hotel front desk. She used to count her hours not by the clock, but by how many she could work before her body gave out. And always, at the center of it all, was Natalie, Elaine. Never planned to do it alone. But when Natalie's father walked away before her first birthday, there was no choice. She became mother, father, protector, provider. Whatever role was needed, she filled it. There were nights when she'd carry a sleeping Natalie up to their tiny apartment, her uniform still smelling of grease and coffee, her arms aching from exhaustion. But every time she saw that little face, peaceful, safe, it felt worth it. When Natalie developed asthma as a child, Elaine learned how to handle the wheezing attacks in the middle of the night. The panicked trips to the emergency room, the nebulizer humming softly beside her daughter's bed as she whispered soothing words, gently rubbing her back through the storm of each episode. She would sit awake until dawn, not because she had to, but because she couldn't bear to leave her side. The sacrifices came without hesitation. When Natalie was rejected from her first choice of college, Elaine held her as she cried, whispering encouragement, promising that it wasn't the end. She stayed up late, helping her rewrite essays, filling out financial aid forms, calling counselors, whatever it took to give her daughter the chance at a future brighter than her own. There were moments of quiet heartbreak too, ones she never spoke of. Like the afternoon she stood in the pawn shop, sliding off her wedding ring, one of the last physical ties to a love that had abandoned her, just to afford a few more months of daycare while she worked. The ring had shimmered under the fluorescent lights for a moment before disappearing behind the counter, exchanged for a wad of bills that barely filled her palm. She had driven home with tears blurring her vision, but her grip on the steering wheel was steady. It was for Natalie. Always for Natalie. Birthdays were simple but joyful. Homemade cakes, thrift store toys polished to look brand new, decorations crafted from dollar store streamers and construction paper. Natalie never seemed to notice the missing luxury. Her eyes sparkled with happiness, believing her mother could create magic out of almost nothing. And for years that belief kept Elaine going. Every scraped knee, every broken heart, every milestone. She was there, steadfast, her love a quiet constant. Elaine never asked for gratitude. She never expected grand gestures of appreciation. The rewards were in the small moments. Watching Natalie walk across the graduation stage, seeing her smile during her first job interview, holding her hand on her wedding day. Those were the victories. And in each one, Elaine quietly reminded herself that the long hours, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights had all been worth it. But now, sitting alone in a house once filled with those memories, she couldn't help but feel the ache of how distant it all seemed. She had given everything, and while she never asked for much in return, she had hoped for something more than this growing distance, something more than being replaced without a second thought. That conversation was wrapped in softness, as if delivering a blow with silk gloves. Natalie sat across from her at the kitchen table, stirring her coffee with nervous hands. Elaine watched the small spoon circle the mug over and over, waiting for the words that hung heavily in the space between them. She already sensed what was coming. She had seen it building. The longer absences, the quick dismissals, the babysitter's growing presence in the house. But hearing it would still slice just the same. "Mom," Natalie began gently, her voice wrapped in that careful tone she used when she didn't want to sound cruel. "We've been thinking about what's best for Sophie." She looked up, eyes searching Elaine's face. "With your back acting up and how tired you've been lately, we just feel it might be better if we had someone younger, more energetic, professional." Elaine's throat tightened, but she managed a small, polite nod. "Of course," she said softly, forcing the corners of her mouth to lift into something resembling a smile. "If that's what you think is best. We're not trying to hurt your feelings, Mom. You've done so much already." Natalie reached across the table, placing her hand over Elaine's as if to soften the dismissal. "But Sophie needs someone who can keep up with her now. And honestly, it'll take some pressure off you. You've earned some rest." Elaine simply nodded again, her voice failing her. The words tasted metallic in her mouth. She could feel Sophie playing at her feet, oblivious to the undercurrent swirling above her head. The little girl giggled as she stacked her wooden blocks, occasionally looking up at her grandmother with a bright, toothy grin that Elaine returned, holding back the sting behind her eyes. Later that afternoon, as Elaine gathered Sophie's toys, into their bin she heard Natalie's voice drift from the hallway. The babysitter had arrived and was chatting with Natalie in hushed, casual tones. Elaine hadn't meant to listen, but the words reached her anyway, clear and sharp as broken glass. "Honestly," Natalie said, lowering her voice slightly, "Mom's just not reliable anymore. It's hard to trust she'll remember the schedules. The appointments. I can't take that risk with work. And it's Easier this way. The babysitter gave a small, sympathetic hum. Yeah, it's tough when parents start to decline. Elaine froze, clutching one of Sophie's tiny stuffed animals to her chest, the fabric soft against her fingers, but the words digging hard into her ribs. Not reliable, declining. A burden to be quietly phased out, like a once-loved sweater, now too worn to wear. She quietly backed into the bathroom, locking the door behind her. The moment the latch clicked, her composure crumbled. The tears came fast, hot and silent, streaming down her cheeks as she leaned against the cool tile wall, her shoulders trembling. She pressed her fist to her mouth, muffling the sobs that threatened to break free. She wouldn't let Sophie hear her cry. They had taken her presence for granted. They had quietly erased her role in Sophie's life, replaced her with convenience, excused it as necessity. But they had assumed too much. She had something left, something they hadn't taken, because they never thought to ask. And now, for the first time in months, Elaine felt the dull ache inside her chest shift into something else. Not anger, not grief. Resolve. The office was warm, quiet, and smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. Elaine sat across from Mr. Whitaker, an estate attorney recommended by one of the few old friends she still spoke to. The man was in his late 50s, his glasses perched low on his nose as he carefully reviewed the stack of documents laid out between them. Elaine's hands were steady as she folded them on her lap, her expression composed, almost serene. She had rehearsed this meeting in her mind for weeks, not out of anger, not even out of bitterness anymore, but with a calm certainty that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done. For too long, she had waited for Natalie's love to return, for some acknowledgement of the years she had given, but that hope had long since evaporated. Now, there was only clarity. Mr. Whitaker looked up from the papers. Everything you've brought is in perfect order, Mrs. Dawson. The deed is still solely in your name, and your financial accounts remain independently controlled. You've done well to keep those separate. Elaine offered a small nod. I've always tried to keep my affairs simple. She allowed a faint smile to cross her face, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. And you're certain about the changes to your will? He asked gently. I am. It hadn't been a difficult decision. When she thought about who truly deserved whatever she would one day leave behind, Natalie's name no longer came to mind. Instead, her thoughts had turned to Caroline, a distant cousin she hadn't seen in years, but who had once, long ago, shown her a kindness Elaine had never forgotten. After Robert's passing, when grief had nearly swallowed her whole, it was Caroline who drove across 3 states to sit with her, to make sure she ate, to listen without judgment. They hadn't grown close in the years since, but that single act had stayed with Elaine, shining like a beacon through all the disappointments that followed. Caroline has no expectation of this, Elaine said softly, which is why she's the right choice. She helped me when no one else did. She never asked for anything. Mr. Whitaker marked the documents, his pen gliding smoothly across the heavy paper. The will designates her as your sole heir, all financial assets, the house, and any remaining. Property will pass directly to her, bypassing probate. He slid another set of documents forward. We've also updated your medical proxy and power of attorney. Should anything happen, your care decisions will rest with a neutral professional, not your daughter. Elaine reached for the pen, pausing for just a moment as she absorbed the weight of the decision. But there was no doubt, no hesitation clawing at her chest. She signed with firm strokes, each signature steady, each page flipped with quiet finality, as he. The final page settled into place. Mr. Whitaker gathered the stack neatly and offered her a respectful nod. It's all done, Mrs. Dawson. You've taken the necessary steps to ensure your wishes are protected. Thank you, she said softly, her voice calm, unwavering. Walking out of the office into the cool afternoon air, Elaine felt lighter. Not because any of this had been easy, but because it had been necessary. She wasn't trying to punish Natalie. She had simply accepted what was true. The daughter she raised was no longer the person she thought she knew. For years, she had lowered her voice, swallowed her hurt, and waited for love to return. But love offered under conditions wasn't love at all. It was leverage. Now, there was no leverage left. She stopped by the small cafe on the corner, ordering herself a cup of tea to go. As she sat on a nearby bench sipping the warm liquid, she watched the world pass her by. People rushing to appointments, parents juggling strollers and shopping bags, young couples laughing into their phones. It was all so busy, so full of life. But she didn't feel left out anymore. She felt still, solid. Elaine no longer needed to raise her voice to be heard. She didn't need to demand apologies that would never come, or force closeness that no longer existed. Instead, she had done what she always did, quietly, methodically, and with dignity. She had protected herself. She had reclaimed control over what was hers. And now the path ahead was hers alone to walk, no longer dictated by the choices of those who had long since stopped choosing her. The for sale sign went up on a Tuesday morning, planted firmly in the front yard like a declaration. The lawn had been freshly trimmed, the garden weeded and blooming, just as Elaine had always kept it. But this time, the work wasn't done for anyone else. The house looked proud again, dignified, as if it too knew this was the end of something, long overdue. Elaine stood in the doorway, arms folded gently across her chest, watching as the real estate photographer snapped pictures of the warm kitchen, the sunny living room, the nursery that had once been Natalie's, then Sophie's. Memories drifted through the halls, but they no longer clung to her like they used to. They passed through her now, acknowledged, respected, but no longer in control. The first calls came quickly, curious neighbors, interested buyers. But it wasn't until the third day that Natalie finally arrived. Her car screeched to a halt. In front of the house, the door flying open before the engine had even stopped humming. She stormed up the driveway, face flushed, phone still in her hand, mouth already moving. "Mom, what is this? Are you selling the house? You didn't even... Tell me!" Her voice was sharp, laced with disbelief. "You can't just... This is Sophie's childhood home. What are you thinking?" Elaine didn't flinch. She remained where she stood in the entryway, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. Behind her, the walls that had once held family photos now stood mostly bare, carefully cleared in preparation. "For showings, I'm thinking," Elaine said calmly, "that this house was never yours to fight over." Natalie blinked, taken aback by the flatness in her mother's tone. "What's that supposed to mean?" Elaine didn't elaborate. She stepped aside and handed her daughter a cardboard box. It was empty, clean, labeled with a piece of masking. Tape that read, "Natalie, hall closet." Nothing more, nothing angry. Just the truth in a brown box. The few things Natalie still kept at the house, spare clothes, old books, scattered remnants of a childhood long gone, were packed neatly in the guest room, ready to go. "I thought you should have a chance to collect your things before the sale closes," Elaine said simply. Natalie looked down at the box, then back up at her mother, stunned. "You're serious? You're actually doing this?" Elaine nodded once. "I am." The silence between them stretched, tight and unfamiliar. Natalie stepped inside, moving as if in a dream. "After everything? After all the years you helped me, and now this?" Elaine's eyes didn't waver. "After all the years I helped you, yes." Natalie's mouth opened, then closed again. She looked around the house, as if trying to reclaim it with her gaze, as if the walls themselves might rise up to take her, sighed. But the house was quiet. It had seen the shift. It had lived through the years of neglect, the slow fade of gratitude, the weight of being taken for granted. It stood now in quiet agreement with the woman who had kept it alive all these years. "I thought you were just being dramatic," Natalie muttered. When you stopped answering calls, when you got distant. I thought you were punishing me." Elaine softened, but only slightly. "I stopped begging to be seen. That's different." Natalie looked down, her voice cracking. "What about Sophie?" Elaine's eyes glistened, but her tone stayed even. "She'll know I loved her. Always. But I'm not going to keep fighting to stay in a life that no longer has space for me." The two women stood there, facing each other with a chasm between them. Not built in a day, but brick by brick, over years of silence, assumptions, and quiet dismissals. Elaine wasn't angry anymore. That had passed. What remained now was certainty, boundaries, peace. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Elaine said softly. "And I'm not asking for understanding. I'm just done asking." She stepped back, letting Natalie take the box. Her daughter stared at it a moment longer, then slowly turned and walked out. No slammed doors, no raised voices. Just the sound of footsteps fading down the path. Elaine watched her go, the weight in her chest lighter than it had been in years. The house was nearly empty now, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt free. As she closed the door behind her, she exhaled deeply, her shoulders dropping just slightly, her breath smooth. The home she had once built for everyone else was no longer her prison. It was her final gift to herself, and letting go was the most powerful thing she'd ever done. These say. First call came the next morning. Elaine's phone buzzed against the kitchen counter as she poured herself a fresh cup of tea, the soft ring cutting through the quiet like a sharp needle. She glanced at the screen. Natalie. The name flashed persistently, almost desperately. Elaine let it ring, watching the call expire without so much as reaching for the device. The betrayal wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, disguised in soft reassurances and gentle excuses. That's what made it hurt more. Natalie hadn't needed to scream or accuse her of anything. She simply stopped seeing her mother's worth, like flipping a switch. The woman who had once nursed her through fevers, comforted her through breakups, sacrificed her own dreams to keep Natalie's alive, reduced now to someone who was simply not reliable anymore. Elaine had always known she wouldn't be needed forever, but she never expected to be discarded like this. She never imagined that the love she poured into raising her daughter would one day be repaid with this quiet erasure. The ache in her chest tightened with each breath, and she let herself cry fully for a few precious minutes, tucked behind that locked door where no one could see her break. When she finally wiped her face and looked at herself in the mirror, her reflection stared back with red-rimmed eyes but a steady gaze. She would smile when she stepped out of that room. She would not let them see the wound still bleeding beneath her skin. But somewhere deep inside, something small and fierce began to spark. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything began to shift. The house was never meant to be this quiet. It used to breathe with life, the clatter of dishes, the hum of conversations, the soft patter of Sophie's small feet running across the kitchen floor. Now it sat hollow, every sound swallowed by the still air. Elaine sat at the kitchen table, her hands resting lightly on the empty surface, staring at the untouched place setting she'd laid out earlier as if on instinct. One plate, one fork, a cup of tea gone cold. It was Christmas, but there were no lights strung around the windows, no smell of gingerbread wafting from the oven. The tree she used to decorate with Natalie and Sophie stood boxed in the corner, unopened, untouched. Natalie had called weeks before, her voice polite, apologetic. "We're doing something small this year, Mom. Just us and a few of Jason's colleagues. Sophie's so excited to see their kids." She had said it as though Elaine would naturally understand, as though her absence was already a given. Elaine had smiled through the call, saying all the right things. "Of course, dear. Have a wonderful time." When she hung up, the house had seemed even quieter, as though absorbing her words and folding them into its growing emptiness. The same scene repeated through every holiday. Easter, Mother's Day, Sophie's birthday, each one arriving like an old friend who no longer knocked on her door. Her phone would sometimes buzz with a quick photo sent from Natalie. Sophie hunting for eggs, blowing out candles, unwrapping, brightly colored gifts. Elaine would stare at the pictures for long minutes, her finger brushing across the screen, savoring what little glimpses she was offered. But the calls grew fewer. The invitations stopped altogether. Even on her own birthday, the silence held firm. She had baked a small cake for herself, more out of habit than hope. She lit a single candle, its small flame flickering in the dim light. No one called. No card arrived. She sat at the table, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, waiting for a knock or a ring that never came. When the candle finally burned low, she blew it out alone. The loneliness wasn't just in the absence of her daughter. It reached further, touching every corner of her life. Many of her old friends had drifted away, some lost to illness, others scattered by distance or their own family obligations. The coffee dates, the afternoon walks, the shared laughter that once filled her days had dissolved into memories. When she reached out, the conversations felt thin, labored, and often brief. People were busy, their lives full of new chapters. That didn't include her. Her phone sat on the counter most days, its screen dark and still. She checked it more often than she wanted to admit, hoping for a missed call, a forgotten message, even one of Natalie's short, impersonal texts. But each time she picked it up, it greeted her with the same silent blankness. Elaine tried calling a few times. At first, Natalie would answer, her tone light but distracted. "Sorry, Mom. Can I call you back? I'm just running out the door." The callbacks never came. Eventually, even those brief exchanges faded. The calls went unanswered altogether, the ringtone echoing into an endless void. After a while, Elaine stopped trying. The house became a companion of sorts, its silence mirroring her own. She would sit in her living room for hours, reading books she could barely focus on, watching television shows she had seen before. Meals became small, functional things: toast, soup, a single apple sliced carefully on a plate. The once lively kitchen now felt too large, every creak of the floorboards amplifying the absence. At night, the ache settled deeper. The bed, once shared with her late husband and later filled with Sophie's giggles during sleepovers, now felt too wide. She would lie awake, listening to the soft ticking of the clock, counting the spaces between its steady rhythm. Each tick seemed to mark another inch of distance growing between her and the world she once knew. She often wondered how it had come to this, how a lifetime of giving, of sacrifice, could dissolve into such emptiness. She had done everything right, hadn't she? Worked tirelessly, supported Natalie through every struggle, loved Sophie with every fiber of her being. And yet, here she sat, alone in a house full of memories no one wanted to share anymore. The afternoon sun cast long slats of light across the dusty attic as Elaine slowly climbed the creaking wooden steps. She hadn't been up here in years. The air smelled of cedar and old paper, heavy with the weight of time. Stacks of boxes lined the narrow space, their corners softened and bowed from years of quiet neglect. Most were filled with forgotten holiday decorations, Sophie's old toys, Natalie's childhood art projects, fragments of a life that once pulsed with so much meaning. Today, she hadn't come up looking for anything in particular. She just needed to move, to fill the long, empty hours with something other than waiting. As she knelt beside one of the boxes marked "Important Papers," her hand brushed over the brittle cardboard, and she slowly lifted the lid. Inside were old tax returns, insurance documents, carefully labeled folders she hadn't opened since her husband's passing. And then, there it was, a thick manila envelope, heavier than the others. She pulled it out and sat cross-legged on the attic floor, brushing off a thin film of dust. Carefully, she opened it and unfolded the documents inside. Her eyes scanned the bold black print, and for a moment, her breath caught. Property title, 100% ownership, Elaine Margaret Dawson. Her name, only her name. She blinked, her mind processing what it meant. She had almost forgotten that years ago, when Natalie first suggested adding her name to the deed just to make things easier down the road, Elaine had hesitated. She loved her daughter, trusted her, but something had made her hold off, telling Natalie they'd revisit it later. And then life, in all its distractions, had swept them along, and the conversation had been forgotten. The house was still fully hers. The paper shook slightly in her hands as she stared at it, the edges crinkling under her tightening grip. This home, the one where she had raised Natalie, where she had built a life from scraps after her husband's death, was still her sanctuary, her legacy. Despite everything, Natalie had no legal claim to it. Elaine had never truly handed it over. The realization settled into her chest like a slow-burning ember, radiating a warmth she hadn't felt in months. As she tucked the deed back into the envelope, a smaller, yellowed piece of paper slid out and floated gently to the floor. She picked it up, unfolding the creased corners carefully. The handwriting was immediately familiar, steady, strong, written in the neat print of her late husband, Robert. My dearest Elaine, if you're reading this someday, I hope it's with peace in your heart. But if you ever find yourself doubting your place in this house or in this world, I want you to remember, you built this home with your own hands, your sacrifice, your love. Never let anyone make you feel small in your own home. This place holds your strength, your story, and no one can take that from you. With all my love, always, Robert. Elaine's breath caught in her throat. The tears came then, but they were different from the ones that had stained her pillow these last lonely months. These tears carried not just sadness, but something sharper beneath, a steadying force that rose from somewhere deep within her chest. His words wrapped around her like a blanket, anchoring her where she sat in the attic's dim glow. For so long, she had let herself shrink, accepting Natalie's quiet dismissals, enduring the loneliness like some inevitable storm she was powerless against. But Robert had seen her differently. He had known her strength, even in his absence. And now, as the weight of those long months pressed against her, she felt it too. She wiped her cheeks, inhaling deeply, her eyes scanning the dusty space as if seeing it for the first time. The attic, the house, her life. None of it was lost. She was still here, and unlike the phone calls that went unanswered or the birthdays that passed unnoticed, this piece of paper was something real, something hers. An hour later, it rang again, and again. Each time Natalie left a message, her voice shifting through stages, urgent, pleading, increasingly frantic. "Mom, please, can we talk? I didn't realize how serious you were. You don't have to. Do this. We can figure something out. Call me back." Then a few messages later. "You're overreacting. You've always been so dramatic, Mom. This isn't fair." And finally, the bargaining began. "Look, if it's about the house, maybe we can split the money. We can sit down like adults, work something out. I don't want to lose you." Elaine listened to none of them. She silenced the phone, entirely, placed it face down on the table, and sat with her tea as the morning sun filled the kitchen. The warmth of the light streamed in through the window, dancing softly on the freshly polished wood floors. The house was almost completely packed now, only a few final boxes stacked neatly by the door. The sale had closed 2 days earlier. The proceeds, now resting securely in her newly established accounts, were no one's business but her own. By the end of the week, the moving truck arrived. The men carefully loaded her belongings into the van, fewer than she had anticipated. She had kept only what she loved, framed photos, her favorite books, the delicate china Robert had once given her for their anniversary. Everything else had been donated or sold. She had no interest in bringing the weight of the past with her into this new chapter. Her new apartment sat on the third floor of a modest building across town. It was smaller, simpler, but perfect. Large windows lined the living room, offering a wide, unbroken view of the park below. In the mornings, she could sit on her small balcony with a cup of tea and listen to the wind rustling the trees. In the evenings, she watched the city lights flicker on one by one like stars slowly waking up. It was here that Elaine rediscovered her own rhythm. She joined a local poetry club at the community center, something she'd always wanted to do but never found the time for. The group met twice a week, gathering around a circle of soft chairs with steaming mugs of coffee and stacks of well-worn books. They read aloud, shared their own writing, and sometimes simply sat together in companionable silence. The words that had lived inside her for years now found space to breathe. She wrote about love, about loss, about quiet strength. She wrote about the weight of invisible sacrifices, about the quiet bravery of letting go. And with every poem, every gentle nod from her fellow writers, she felt lighter. Natalie continued to call for weeks. The voicemails shifted tone repeatedly, guilt, desperation, flashes of anger, then back to pleading. But Elaine no longer carried the need to respond. She didn't block the number. She didn't erase the messages. She simply didn't pick up. For so many years she had waited for her daughter's voice to sound like love again, to sound like it once had when Natalie was small, reaching up for her hand, trusting her completely. But that version of her daughter no longer existed, and Elaine had finally stopped grieving for it. Now, when her phone buzzed, she barely noticed. The calls became background noise, like passing traffic, present but unimportant. On her balcony one late afternoon, Elaine sat with a fresh cup of tea, watching the golden sunlight paint the tops of the trees. A cool breeze lifted a strand of hair from her face as she closed her eyes and listened to the world move gently around her. There was no one demanding her time, no one questioning her worth, no one reducing her to something expendable. She was not hiding. She was not broken. She was not bitter. She was simply free. For the first time in years, she lived entirely on her own terms, wrapped not in silence or loneliness, but in peace. The chaos behind her no longer reached these walls, and as her phone buzzed once more inside on the kitchen, "A counter," she smiled softly, let it ring, and took another sip of her tea. The morning light poured gently through the wide windows, casting a soft golden glow across the small writing desk in the corner of Elaine's new apartment. She sat quietly, pen in hand, the fresh pages of her leather-bound journal open before her. The hum of the city drifted in faintly through the slightly cracked window, mingling with the soft chirping of birds from the park below. It was a peaceful kind of stillness, not empty, not lonely, but full in a way that felt new. Her handwriting was slow and deliberate as she wrote, the words unfolding like a quiet conversation with herself. "There's a difference between being needed and being loved," she wrote. "For so long I confused the two. I believed my value was tied to how much I could give, how useful I was to others. If I wasn't providing something, then what was I? Who was I?" She paused, her pen hovering for a moment before continuing. "But being needed is conditional. It's a transaction, an exchange. And when people no longer need you, they believe you've lost your worth. But love, true love, exists even when there's nothing left to take." Her eyes drifted toward the park. A group of small children, no older than Sophie had once been, chased each other across the grass while a teacher clapped and encouraged them to form a circle. Their laughter rose to her window like music. She smiled, setting the pen down for a moment, letting the warmth of the scene settle in her chest. Every Thursday, Elaine walked 2 blocks to the local daycare and spent her mornings reading stories. stacking blocks and gently rocking toddlers to sleep during nap time. The director had been surprised when she first offered to volunteer. "We rarely get people who aren't here for their grandkids," she had said with a smile. But Elaine had simply replied, "I just like being around them." And she did. The children didn't look at her as someone filling in for a parent or as a backup plan. They didn't measure her by what she could offer or how many hours she could save them. To the children, she was simply Miss Elaine, the kind woman who read The Very Hungry Caterpillar with funny voices and always remembered everyone's favorite color. It was different here. It wasn't obligation. It wasn't tethered to guilt or expectation. It was presence, simple, honest, and freely given. She picked up her pen again. "For a long time, I thought I failed. That maybe I wasn't enough, that I did something wrong. But the truth is, I loved fully. I sacrificed fully, and I gave without ever keeping score. That is not failure. That is not weakness." Her writing slowed slightly as her thoughts settled into clarity. "I wasn't a burden. I was just inconvenient to people who never deserved me." The words sat on the page like a quiet declaration. She read them again, letting them absorb into her skin, into her bones. For months, she had carried the weight of her daughter's rejection. Like a scar, raw, sensitive, constantly aching. But now the wound had closed. The scar remained, but it no longer hurt. It simply marked where she had once given too much of herself to someone who didn't value it. Elaine closed the journal softly, running her hand across the cover as if sealing those words into her soul. She glanced at the clock, almost time, to head to the daycare. A soft breeze rustled the curtains as she stood, pulling on her light jacket and slipping her shoes on by the door. As she walked through the bustling streets toward the daycare, she passed young mothers with strollers, couples walking hand in hand, groups of teenagers laughing on their way to school. The world moved around her, full of lives she was no longer entangled in. And yet, she felt no longing, no emptiness, just peace. At the daycare, small voices cheered when she walked in, little hands reaching up to greet her. She knelt down, welcoming them with a warm smile and open arms. Her identity was no longer wrapped around the roles others had once assigned her. She was not just a mother or grandmother, not just someone who existed to serve others. She was Elaine, whole, steady, enough as. She read stories to the children that morning, her voice calm and playful. She caught her own reflection in the window, a woman no longer shrinking for others, but quietly blooming for herself. The evening settled gently over the city, the sky painted in soft shades of pink and gold as the sun slipped beyond the horizon. In her apartment, Elaine moved calmly through the quiet kitchen, humming softly to the faint tune playing from the old radio in the corner. The warm scent of roasted vegetables and lemon chicken filled the air, blending with the soft instrumental, notes that wrapped around her like a familiar embrace. She set the table carefully, as she always did now. One plate, one set of silverware, a simple cloth napkin folded neatly beside the dish. She placed a single candle in the center of the small table, its flame dancing lightly, casting gentle shadows along the pale walls. The table sat near the wide window, offering her a view of the glowing city lights below. The world outside buzzed with distant life, but here, inside, there was only calm. There was a time when the sight of a table set for one would have filled her with an ache so sharp it threatened to pull her under. When the quiet felt suffocating, when every empty chair was a reminder of what had been lost, of the family dinners, the birthdays, the laughter that once echoed through a different house now owned by strangers. But tonight, the stillness carried no sting. The emptiness no longer haunted her. She hadn't been left behind. She had chosen this. She had walked through the grief, the betrayal, the crushing disappointment, and emerged not bitter, but whole. She poured herself a glass of wine, the rich burgundy swirling gently in the crystal. She raised it slightly, offering a small, private toast, not to anyone else, but to herself. The woman who had weathered every storm without breaking. The woman who had loved deeply and sacrificed fully, and when she was cast aside, had chosen herself anyway. This was not loneliness. This was freedom. The candle's flame flickered as she smiled softly, taking her first bite, savoring the meal she had cooked, not out of obligation, but out of quiet joy. She no longer needed anyone's presence to feel worthy, no longer longed for calls that would not come or apologies that would never arrive. She had learned to release those expectations, to stop mourning the absence of people who had willingly stepped away. Her phone sat silent on the counter. She hadn't checked it all day. She didn't need to. As the music played on, her mind drifted. Back to that day so long ago, sitting on the living room couch, coffee growing cold in her hand, as Natalie handed Sophie to the babysitter. The door had clicked shut behind them, leaving her in that hollow house, unseen and dismissed. But that was then. Now she sat in a home she had chosen, surrounded by peace she had built with her own hands. The silence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like space to breathe, to write, to read, to simply exist, without shrinking for the comfort of others. The candlelight reflected in her wine glass as she took another sip, closing her eyes briefly to savor the warmth. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the small diffuser in the corner, blending with the soft aroma of her meal. The world beyond her window carried on, but she was exactly where she needed to be, and as the clock ticked softly in the background, as the city lights blinked against the velvet sky, Elaine whispered the words she had come to understand more deeply than ever before. This time, I ate at my table, alone and free.